Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Ashen Seal, by Paisley MacDonald. There are cases in the long chronicle of my association with Sherlock Holmes which impressed themselves upon my memory not through violence or sensation, but through the peculiar quality of their silence. The affair of the Ashen Seal was such a case. It began with the ghost of a dead man's guilt, moved through rooms that smelled of ash and bitter almonds, and concluded beside the Thames on a night when the fog lay so thick upon the water that London might have ceased to exist beyond the reach of a lantern. It was, as Holmes afterward observed, a crime constructed with theatrical patience, and it was only the finest instrument of logical analysis I have ever known that prevented it from succeeding entirely. The late November of 1894 descended upon London with unusual malice. A wet, yellow fog had settled over the city for the better part of a week, pressing down upon the rooftops of Marylebone like a cold compress applied by an indifferent physician. From the windows of our sitting-room at 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps in the street below were rendered into nothing more than blurred discs of amber light, and the figures passing beneath them were shapeless and furtive, as though the fog were engaged in some steady work of erasure. I had called that morning in response to a note from Holmes, who had been in one of his reflective periods. Not the dangerous lassitude of the dark moods I knew too well, but a restless and watchful quiet, as though some interior mechanism were winding itself toward a purpose not yet apparent. He sat in his armchair beside the fire with his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, the morning papers unread on the table at his elbow. The chemical apparatus behind him wore a faint aura of recent experiment. "You are expecting someone," I said, as much from the alertness in his grey eyes as from any direct evidence. "A young woman," said Holmes, without moving. "She has been standing at the corner of Baker Street for the last 4 minutes, working up her resolve. She will knock within the next 90 seconds. She knocked in 60. Miss Clara Fenwick entered with that restrained self-command which I have often observed in women compelled by circumstance to be braver than their natures prefer. She was perhaps 28, plainly dressed in dark serge that had been carefully brushed, with a face that might have been called handsome had it not been so clearly exhausted by recent strain. Her eyes were intelligent and direct, and the only betrayal of her agitation was the slow, unconscious twisting of her gloves in her lap from the moment she sat down. Holmes, who had scarcely glanced up from the fire, fixed her with one of his swift, illuminating looks that always reminded me of a surgeon's first incision, precise, purposeful, and immediately revealing. "You have come from a house where death has been too hastily called natural," said he. "You earn your living by the pen. Within the last 24 hours you have burnt one letter and hidden another, and you believe you were followed here, though you are not certain." The lady started, and the glove in her lap tightened under her fingers. "How can you possibly know that?" she murmured. "The ink stain on your second finger is of the quality that accumulates over years, not days, indicating a secretary or companion's labour. Your cuffs show careful mending at economical intervals. You came unescorted by cab in foul weather, which tells me you do not wish your destination known to any domestic. The slight smell of wood smoke on your sleeve, combined with the absence of any envelopes in your bag despite the crease marks of recent correspondence, suggests destruction of papers, and you glanced behind you twice on the landing. I heard your hesitation at the step." He folded his hands. "Now, Miss Fenwick, tell me about the sealed envelopes." She managed a brief smile, the smile of someone who, having been profoundly startled, is none the less relieved. "Then I was right to come here," she murmured. "For if you know so much already, Mr. Holmes, perhaps you may prevent a second death." She told us her story with admirable economy and clarity. She was companion secretary to Sir Alistair Wynne, a retired colonial administrator of some reputation and considerable private fortune, whose house in Marylebone she had served for the past 3 years. Sir Alistair was a stern and private man, she said, not unkind, but habitually withdrawn, as though long years of imperial responsibility had taught him to keep his own counsel even in company. For the past month, however, that private quality had curdled into something she could only describe as terror. "It began 3 Thursdays ago," she said. "An envelope arrived by the first post, addressed to Sir Alistair only by name. No direction, no sender. Thick cream paper. He opened it at breakfast in my presence, and I saw his face go—" She paused. "I have seen men frightened before, Mr. Holmes. This was different. This was the face of a man who recognized what was coming for him." "The contents?" Holmes asked. "Nothing. The envelope contained nothing whatsoever. Only the seal itself was remarkable." She reached into her bag and produced an envelope, which she laid upon the table. The flap was sealed not with wax, but with some grey material. Ash, it appeared, and pressed into it the impression of a signet ring, a griffin and a broken key. Holmes lifted the envelope between his long fingers and brought it close to the lamp. He did not smell it immediately, as I half expected him to, but turned it in the light, tilting it at several angles before setting it down on the chemical table with the care of a man handling evidence he intends to examine thoroughly later. "There were 3 in total," Miss Fenwick continued, "each on a Thursday, each alike. After the 3rd, Sir Alistair locked himself in his study and would see no one but Mrs. Keene with his evening tonic. He told me—" Her voice caught for the first time slightly. "That if a 4th came, the past would open its grave." I did not know what he meant. "The following morning he was found beside his desk. The doctor said it was apoplexy. He had been unwell for some time." "But you do not believe that," said I. "I believe he died of what was in those envelopes," she said quietly. "Of the fear they carried. And something else is gone." She described a leather dispatch box kept in the study, in which Sir Alistair had maintained a packet of old papers concerning some affair in India 20 years prior. He spoke of them once, only once. He called them the record of a thing that should never have been done. The box was found open and empty after his death. Holmes leaned slightly forward. "You delayed coming to me, nearly a full day after the discovery." "Yes." She looked at the fire. "Because of what he said to me the night before he died. He was agitated, barely coherent, and he gripped my wrist and said, 'If the seal returns, trust no lawyer.'" The quality of Holmes's attention shifted. It was not a movement exactly, more a sudden intensification, like a flame catching on a fresh piece of fuel. He said nothing for a moment, only looked at her with that grey, calculating gaze. "Miss Fenwick," he said at last, "it may be that your employer was not merely frightened to death. I should like to examine the house tomorrow morning. In the meantime, you will take a cab directly back to Marylebone, do not walk, and you will say nothing of this visit to anyone in that household. No one. Is that understood?" She stood, and in doing so regained much of the control she had entered with. "It is, Mr. Holmes. Thank you." When she had gone, Holmes rose from his chair with the sudden restlessness that told me the engine was now fully turning. He picked up the envelope again. "The ash," I said. "What do you make of it?" "The ash," said Holmes, "is extremely interesting, and a little theatrical, which is in itself the most interesting thing about it." He set the envelope down and reached for his pipe. "We shall know more tomorrow, Watson. Get a good night's sleep. The deceased may have been a guilty man, but someone also helped him to his death, and I rather think they are not finished." Sir Alistair Wynne's house presented to the world a face of perfect Victorian respectability. It stood in a terrace of its kind, narrow, dark-bricked, with heavy curtains drawn against the fog and a brass knocker kept to a high polish. Inside, the hallway was sombre, with dark panelling and ancestral portraits. Military men mostly, looking out from their frames with a shared expression of inflexible rectitude that seemed designed to discourage any departure from form. The study occupied the rear of the ground floor. Holmes went directly to it and stood inside the threshold for a full half-minute without moving or speaking, simply looking. I have learned over many years not to disturb this preliminary survey. He saw things in those moments that no amount of subsequent examination could fully reconstruct. The room contained a large mahogany desk, its surface bare except for an overturned glass and a smear of dark liquid on the green leather. A dispatch box of dark leather sat on a table beside the window, its lid raised. Beside the fireplace stood a medicine tray, a small brown tonic bottle, a glass, a spoon. I crossed to the medicine tray before Holmes spoke. It was instinct more than deduction. I had been thinking since Baker Street of what might cause a sudden collapse in an elderly man of weakened constitution while leaving an appearance consistent with apoplexy. I lifted the tonic bottle and unstoppered it with care. "Holmes," I said. I did not say anything further. He was at my side in a moment. He brought the mouth of the bottle beneath his nose without touching it to his face, breathed once, and set it very gently back on the tray. "Bitter almonds," said I, keeping my voice low. "Prussic acid in small quantity, enough to hasten matters considerably in a man already in precarious health. Watson, would you put your handkerchief over that and leave it precisely where it stands? Good." He turned away. Natural death from apoplexy may very well be the correct diagnosis in the broadest sense. A man of Sir Alistair's condition in sufficient terror with his system compromised by cumulative doses of prussic acid introduced into his nightly tonic. The heart would not require much persuasion to stop. He moved next, not to the desk, but to the dispatch box. He did not open it, but crouched beside it, examining the surface. I came to look. The box was coated in a fine, undisturbed dust across most of its surface, but across the lid, the dust was disturbed in a pattern that matched the curved spread of careful fingers. "Gloved hands," Holmes said. "The marks are slightly blurred at the edges. Opened after Sir Alistair fell. Or at least, opened by someone who did not wish to leave prints. And notice the lamp." He straightened. A working gas lamp in the room, yet a spent matchstick on the hearthrug. Someone needed additional light or felt more comfortable with a lantern of their own. He paused. "And this is most useful." He moved to the side of the room where a door, a servant's entry, opened onto a narrow passage leading to the garden. He examined the bolt. It was a simple barrel bolt that should have secured the door from within. He slid it gently back and forth. "It does not catch cleanly," he said. "A person familiar with this house would know that the bolt can be drawn from outside with a thin implement if the door is not also locked." At this moment, Percy Vale appeared in the doorway behind us, a handsome young man in his late 20s, with the look of a person who has spent too long at clubs and not long enough at any occupation. His cuffs were fine, but his eyes were uncertain, moving between Holmes and me with a brightness that suggested anxiety imperfectly controlled. "My uncle's solicitor has authorized Miss Fenwick to give you access," he said. "Though I confess I don't entirely see the purpose. The doctor was quite clear." "You were in this corridor on the night your uncle died," said Holmes, without turning from the window. A pause. "I was in my room." "You were in this corridor. You can be placed there by a detail I shall keep to myself for the present. What were you looking for, Mr. Vale?" Percy's composure collapsed in the way that shallow structures always do, suddenly and completely. I only wanted to see whether Uncle had... There was a matter of some old bills, and I thought perhaps the desk... You thought you might access the desk while the household was distracted by his death, said Holmes not unkindly. Your creditors are pressing you. That is not murder, Mr. Vale, merely poor character. But I should advise you not to lie to me again. It wastes time I cannot spare. The young man left with what dignity remained to him. Holmes watched him go and then stood very still in the middle of the study, his gaze moving in a slow circle from the medicine tray to the dispatch box to the faulty door. "Well," said I. "Someone who knew this household, its routines, its arrangements, its weaknesses, visited here under entirely legitimate pretence within the last week. That person introduced poison into the tonic, which would have begun its slow work over subsequent days. Then, when the time was right, they returned by the garden entrance, and retrieved whatever was in that box. After Sir Alistair had collapsed, while the lamp was still warm and the household not yet fully alarmed." He moved toward the door. "Come, Watson. We have witnesses to interview." The interviews consumed the remainder of that grey afternoon, and they were not without their complications. Holmes had arranged them in a sequence I recognized from previous cases. Begin with the servant who has least reason to fabricate, advance toward those with most, and leave the frightened man for last. It was, he once told me, not unlike the order of courses at a formal dinner. The lightest matter first, the thing most likely to unsettle the digestion saved for the hour when the guests have already committed to the table. Mrs. Martha Keene, the housekeeper, received us in the servants' hall with the settled authority of a woman who has managed large households so long that composure has become structural, woven into her bearing like load-bearing timber. She was perhaps 55, with capable hands and the quality of directness that comes not from boldness but from 20 years of having no time for indirection. She wore no jewellery, kept her grey hair pinned close, and regarded Holmes with the reserved attention of a woman assessing a tradesman who has come without an appointment, willing to hear him out, but prepared to be unimpressed. She had, she told us, seen a figure leave by the garden gate on the evening of Sir Alistair's death. The time was shortly after 10 o'clock. She had gone to the kitchen passage to check the back latch before retiring, and had observed, through the small window above the stone sink, a lean figure moving along the garden path toward the gate. She had taken it for Colonel Dane. "He has visited the house before, the Colonel," she said, folding her hands on the table before her. A lean, grey sort of gentleman. Military walk. I thought little of it at the time. Sir Alistair had not received him to my knowledge, and I assumed the master had turned him away through the study. "You saw the figure's face?" Holmes asked. "No, Mr. Holmes. I saw the back of a dark coat and the set of the shoulders. But it was a military walk." She paused with the precision of an honest witness. "Or what I understood as such. I have not served in the army myself." Holmes pressed her gently on several points: the exact hour, the degree of light in the garden, whether the figure had been carrying anything, and she answered each question with a care that clearly cost her effort. She had not seen anything carried. The light had been poor, a single lamp from the kitchen passage. The gate had closed quietly, which she noted because the latch was ordinarily stiff. As we rose to leave, Holmes turned back with a characteristic afterthought. "The tonic bottle on Sir Alistair's medicine tray," he said. "Who prepared it?" A slight tightening around Mrs. Keene's eyes. "I collected it from the chemist, as always. I set it out each evening. I poured the measure myself." She met his gaze steadily. "If you are implying that I imply nothing," said Holmes pleasantly. "I observe only that you are the sort of woman who would notice if the bottle had been touched or moved between your pouring the measure and the master drinking it. Was anything out of the ordinary on the night in question?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The level was lower than it ought to have been. I remarked on it to myself. I thought perhaps I'd poured generously the night before without noticing." Her expression shifted slightly. Not guilt, I thought, but the cold discomfort of someone understanding, belatedly, the significance of a detail they had filed away as insignificant. "The tray had been moved," she added. "Only slightly. The spoon was on the wrong side. I righted it, without thinking. Outside in the Marylebone Street, Holmes said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then, the tray was moved by someone who replaced the bottle after use. The spoon displacement confirms a right-handed person. Mrs. Keene is left-handed. You observed her pour the tea. She would have righted the spoon to its customary left-side position without understanding what she was correcting. Our second witness was Thomas Rudge, the footman, a young man of perhaps 22, with the guileless discomfort of someone who has recently discovered that honesty has practical consequences. He had intercepted one of the sealed envelopes before delivery, not, he insisted, with any dishonest intent, but because it had arrived on a day when Sir Alistair was not at home, and he had set it on the hall table and when he moved it later remarked upon an unusual smell. "Like a smoking room," he said, looking at the floor rather than at Holmes. "Not common tobacco. Something foreign and expensive. Rich-like. I've smelled it once before at a club where I worked as a temporary porter during the summer." "Which club?" Holmes asked, with no particular emphasis. "The Meridian, sir, in Pall Mall." He picked at the cuff of his livery with a thumbnail. "I couldn't swear to it, mind. I only caught it briefly. But it was distinctive." I could see Holmes note this with particular attention, though his face gave nothing away. The Meridian was Colonel Dane's club. I knew this from an earlier conversation with Miss Fenwick, who had mentioned it in passing as the place where Sir Alistair had once dined with his old associates in better times. I felt a small, neat conviction assembling itself. Dane was our man. The circumstantial geometry was aligning with uncomfortable precision. Mrs. Beatrice Wynne, Sir Alistair's widowed sister-in-law, received us in the morning-room with the composure of a woman determined that grief shall not express itself in any unseemly form. She was angular and pious, dressed entirely in black that had nothing to do with current mourning. She wore it, I thought, as a permanent philosophical position rather than a seasonal response to loss. The room itself had been recently aired. The grate was cold, but the ash had been disturbed, and the room carried the faint, acrid ghost of burnt paper that I had learned, over years of Baker Street chemistry, to identify precisely. "My brother-in-law carried the burdens of empire on his shoulders all his life," she told us, with the measured delivery of someone reciting a prepared text. "He was a man of duty, discipline, and considerable private suffering. He had nothing on his conscience save the weight of long responsibility." She folded her hands in her lap. "Whatever he did in India, he did in the service of the Crown and the good order of the district." It was a curiously specific acquittal for a woman who had not been asked to supply one. Holmes's face remained entirely neutral, but I caught the slight stillness at the corners of his mouth that told me he had registered it precisely. He asked her 2 questions about the household routine: at what hour the medicine tray was typically set out, and whether any visitors had called in the week preceding Sir Alistair's death. And she answered both with brief precision. The tray at 8:30, and yes, the family solicitor had called to review trust matters on the Tuesday. She gave no name, and Holmes did not press her for one. As we descended to the street, I turned up my collar against the cold and felt the weight of what seemed at that moment like a very clear picture. "She is protecting something," I said. "The papers in the grate. She knows about India." "She knows a version of India," Holmes said. "The version she was told by a man who had every reason to construct a favourable account. She burns correspondence regularly. Household accounts, most likely, judging by the ash quality and the quantity, but she burned something more recent within the last day. The ash layer on the new material is thinner and sits above the older residue, which has the compressed character of accumulated months." He raised his hand for a cab. "She is not a villain, Watson. She is a loyal woman protecting a reputation she was told was worth protecting. The tragedy of such loyalty is that it is rarely aimed at something worthy of it." Colonel Septimus Dane met us at his club in a state of poorly suppressed agitation. The Meridian was everything a Pall Mall club of its era aspired to be, heavy with leather and dignity and the layered comfort of men who have spent their lives being managed by institutions and found the arrangement agreeable. Dane himself occupied a chair beside a window draped in claret velvet, a glass of whisky at his elbow, presenting to the room a parade ground posture that had clearly been maintained for 50 years by sheer force of will. He was a lean, upright man in his 60s, with the cracked grey face of someone who has spent decades in harsh climates and has not found comfort since returning. His hands were steady. His eyes were not. When Holmes placed the impression from the Ashen seal before him, a careful pencil rubbing he had taken at the crime scene, Dane set down his whisky glass with a hand that was not entirely steady. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. The sound of other men's conversations filled the room behind us, the particular contented murmur of those with no urgent reason to be elsewhere. He produced, from an inside pocket, an envelope still sealed. Received that very morning, he said. It bore the same impression. He laid it on the table between us with the care of a man placing down a weapon he has decided not to use. "I know what this is," he said. "I have known for 3 weeks, since Alistair first told me of the envelopes. Someone has found out about Bransby." He looked at Holmes directly for the first time. "I am not going to lie to you, Mr. Holmes. I have had 30 years of knowing this was coming, and I am tired of the waiting. I will tell you what I can." He told us, in the clipped and economical manner of a man who has rehearsed the admission without ever quite committing to it, that in 1874 a fellow officer named Bransby had made a serious and well-documented accusation against Sir Alistair Wynne concerning irregularities in the administration of a Calcutta district. There had been improper seizures of property. There had been false evidence against native landowners. There had been, he said, his voice dropping, a matter of a man flogged for insolence who had not been insolent and who did not recover from it. Bransby had attempted to bring the matter forward through official channels. He had found those channels blocked by men who owed Wynne their appointments. He had tried to go further, to higher authority, and evidence had been made to disappear. Documents had been altered. Testimony had been arranged. And Bransby had been brought down instead, a carefully constructed case of collusion, false charges of sympathy with agitators, a court-martial that had known its conclusion before it began. "Trafton smoothed the ecclesiastical side of things," Dane said, with a bitterness that had clearly been aging for some time. "He had a bishop's ear, useful in those days, and I said nothing. I was ambitious. I told myself Bransby had been rash and had brought his ruin upon himself, and I said it often enough that for some years I nearly believed it." He turned his glass in his fingers. "He had a son, very young. I do not know what became of the boy." Holmes pressed him, with the patient but direct persistence I knew well for any name connected to the affair, a clerk, a legal representative, anyone who might have known the precise details of the suppressed evidence rather than merely the broad outline of the injustice. Dane thought for a long time. "There was a legal firm," he said at last, reluctantly. "They acted briefly for Bransby before he lost the means to pay them. I cannot recall the name. Something with a Latin quality. They had a device on their correspondence, an unusual seal. He described it without being asked. A griffin and a broken key. I saw Holmes's attention quicken. He did not show it. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, as though this were merely a supplementary detail. "You mentioned the smell of these envelopes. Would you describe it?" Dane frowned. "I cannot say I remarked on it particularly." "You remarked on it to no one?" Holmes said pleasantly. "In this room, for instance?" Dane looked at the humidor on the table beside his chair, a polished box of dark wood, its lid ajar, releasing the deep, complex fragrance of a very particular Turkish blend. He looked back at Holmes. "I may have opened the envelope in here," he said carefully, "before I understood what it was." "Of course," said Holmes, "naturally. In the cab on the way to Kensington I was certain we were about to confront a murderer. The tobacco was Dane's. The figure at the garden gate had moved like Dane. He had motive in abundance, since a living Wynne was the last man between him and the complete suppression of the Calcutta matter. He had access to the club's Turkish blend in quantities sufficient to scent a series of envelopes without any member of staff noticing. He was a former military man of exactly the lean, grey, upright cast that Mrs. Keene had described. I thought Holmes was winding the net and preparing to close it. "You are composing your account of the arrest," Holmes said, without looking up from the window. "I am merely—" "You are satisfied that Dane is our man. I can see it in the quality of your silence, Watson. It has become comfortable, which is always a dangerous sign." He folded his hands. "Consider this. A man wishing to send anonymous, menacing letters does not perfume them with his own distinctive club tobacco, a blend sold in London at precisely 2 establishments, associated at the Meridian Club with no more than a handful of regular smokers. That scent is, in effect, a signature. No man of Dane's intelligence and nerve, who has spent 30 years concealing his part in a complex crime, makes so elementary an error." He glanced at me briefly. "Unless he is not the sender. Unless the sender wished the envelopes traced to him." The implication landed with the slightly cold sensation of a bucket of water applied to a confident conclusion. "Someone borrowed or obtained his tobacco," I said, "or obtained access to the envelopes after their preparation and introduced the scent deliberately. A small amount, worked into the paper. It would require only a visit to the club and a few minutes in Dane's immediate proximity. The man we are looking for has legitimate reasons to visit that club, and Dane would not have found the presence remarkable." He leaned back. "The figure at the garden gate, Watson." Mrs. Keene saw a lean, grey military walk, but she saw it in poor light, at a distance, from a window above eye level. A man who has been studying Colonel Dane for months, his posture, his gait, could reproduce that effect sufficiently to satisfy one witness in poor conditions. It is not proof, it is preparation. Our final call was upon the Reverend Abel Trafton at his modest house in the Kensington back streets, a house that matched its occupant in the quality of its self-effacement, modest, well-maintained, reluctant to draw attention. The Reverend was a small, dry, tremulous man who had clearly been expecting someone, if not us, specifically. He admitted us to his study with the manner of a man who has been dreading a particular knock for so long that its actual arrival produces, alongside fear, an involuntary relief. The room contained the tools of pastoral administration: correspondence neatly stacked, a Bible with a worn spine, a small portrait of a woman I took to be his late wife. On his desk, almost prominently, as though placed there in expectation of this conversation, lay an unopened, sealed envelope. The familiar Ashen impression was visible on the flap. "It is God's judgment," he said, when Holmes placed the rubbing beside it. "I have known it would come. I have known since Sir Alistair wrote to me 3 weeks ago to say he had received the first one." His voice had the quality of a rope that has been under tension for a very long time and has begun to fray. I wrote back to tell him we must confess. He wrote back to tell me we must not. And now he is dead. He confessed, not to murder, but to the old wrong, with a completeness that suggested the account had been composed in his mind many times. Captain Edmund Bransby had discovered financial irregularities and illegal reprisals carried out under Sir Alistair's authority in Calcutta. He had tried to bring the matter forward through official channels. Evidence had been suppressed. Documents had been altered. Trafton's own contribution had been to provide false character testimony through the ecclesiastical network, letters from men of the church affirming Bransby's instability of mind and sympathy with native agitators. "I knew it was false when I wrote it," he said. He did not look away. "I wrote it because I was afraid, and I have not had a night's proper sleep since." Bransby had been stripped of his commission, tried and convicted of manufactured charges. He had been dead within 18 months of the verdict, the cause listed as fever, though Trafton's face when he said the word told its own story. "There was a son," Trafton said. His voice had become barely more than a thread, as though the decades of guilt had worn it thin. "He was very young when all of this happened. 7 or 8 years old, perhaps. We never knew what became of him. He would be in his 30s by now." Holmes sat very still. "Did anyone in your circle ever employ a solicitor of the name Mowbray?" he asked. Trafton blinked. "Mowbray? Yes, the Wynne Estate Trust. Sir Alistair had used their firm for some years. A young man, quite capable, I believe. Very precise. I met him once, briefly, at a dinner. He asked me one question about India, and then did not speak to me for the remainder of the evening." He paused. "I remember thinking he disliked me. I could not account for it at the time. In the hansom on the way back to Baker Street I sat in the particular silence of a man whose theory has been dismantled and replaced." "Dane's tobacco," I said. "It was on the envelopes." "So Rudge told us," Holmes said, "which is precisely why I do not believe Dane sent them. Consider what we have. A scent that implicates Dane, a silhouette that Mrs. Keene believes was Dane, and a motive that Dane possesses in common with 2 other men. 3 arrows pointing at the same target, each originating from a different source. In my experience, Watson, coincidences of that geometric precision are never coincidences at all. They are arrangements." He looked at the fog sliding past the window with that faraway quality his eyes took on when the machinery of his mind was running fastest. "The question is not who has a motive for Wynne's death. The question is who has a motive, the technical means, the legal access, and 20 years of patient preparation, and who, furthermore, knew enough about Dane's tobacco, Mrs. Keene's viewing angle, and the faulty garden bolt to construct a version of events pointing directly at a man who, whilst guilty in conscience, is innocent of this particular crime." He leaned slightly forward. "I need to look at a set of legal papers. It will require a visit to Chancery Lane. Mr. Julian Mowbray's offices occupied the 2nd floor of a building near Chancery Lane that existed, as so many legal chambers do, in a state of dignified permanence, dark oak, deed boxes in worn green leather stacked along every wall, the faintest smell of old paper that is peculiar to rooms in which other people's disputes have been interred. A clerk admitted us, explaining that Mr. Mowbray was attending to distant matters, and not expected until the following morning. Holmes had not come to see Mowbray. He had come at the request he'd presented to the clerk as merely professional, to examine archived correspondence relating to the Wynne Estate Trust, for which Mowbray's firm served as solicitors of record. Holmes was not primarily interested in the trust papers. He was searching the office. It was a procedure I have observed many times, the swift, systematic examination of a room that appears to any observer entirely casual. He moved along the shelves, hands rarely touching anything, eyes doing the greater part of the work. He paused at a particular deed box. He paused again at a sheaf of papers stacked beside the letterpress, and then he found it. An old archive file, its edges brown with age, bearing on its cover, in faded print, the device of a firm now long dissolved. A griffin, a broken key. "The Bransby connection," Holmes said very quietly. "Captain Bransby sought representation from this firm. Mowbray subsequently acquired their archive." He turned the file over. On the reverse, in pencil, barely visible, was a name written twice, as though someone was practicing a signature that was not their own. Edmund Bransby. E. Bransby. Billy's boy arrived at Baker Street. We found a telegram awaiting us on our return. It was from Miss Fenwick's address, written in an unfamiliar hand. reporting that Miss Fenwick had left the house an hour earlier with a gentleman she appeared to know. She had said only that she was going to recover an important document. She had not returned. Holmes read this twice and stood entirely still for the space of 4 seconds, which from him was the equivalent of considerable alarm. "She has been used," he said. "Mowbray believes she may know the location of a duplicate, a second copy of the Bransby affidavit which Sir Alistair may have lodged elsewhere." He sent a note summoning her. "Watson, I need you to get word to Lestrade. Tell him the Limehouse warehouse at Pickle Herring Street since closed. I need 1 hour before he moves. 1 hour, not less. And Clara Fenwick. I know where she is." He was already at the door. "I worked out Mowbray's habits of operation some time ago. He always chooses locations he has a legal pretext for visiting, surplus property held in trust for a dissolved firm. He is not an impulsive man. That is his great strength, and tonight his ruin." Fog lay so thick upon the river at Limehouse that the Thames itself was absent, present only as a sound, a cold insistence of water moving somewhere in the grey dark. The warehouse was a vast, abandoned structure, smelling of damp rope and old hemp and the residue of years of commercial necessity, its windows blind, its doors held by a padlock that Holmes opened in under 40 seconds. We found Miss Fenwick in a storeroom at the rear, not bound, not harmed, but pale with anger rather than fear, which told me a good deal about her character. She had been locked in after the man who had brought her here. A stranger, she said, not Mowbray himself, had taken the letter she had been told would prove her employer's innocence and left without a word. "He was an associate," Holmes said. "A messenger, nothing more. The letter was a decoy I arranged to be planted, a forgery. I needed it passed to Mowbray through his own channels so that he would believe a genuine duplicate affidavit was in play." He gave her his coat. "I must ask you to remain here for a little longer. What now occurs will require a slightly larger audience." He had, in the 24 hours since the Chancery Lane visit, accomplished something I only fully understood in retrospect. Through information carefully placed in the right hands, a whisper to a clerk here, a word left with a certain Court of Session reporter there, he had circulated the story that Reverend Trafton had found, among old papers left to him after Wynne's death, a surviving copy of the Bransby affidavit, and that an exchange was to take place privately that night. Within the hour, they came. Lestrade arrived first with 2 constables, who concealed themselves among the crates at Holmes's direction with more efficiency than I might have expected of them. Colonel Dane arrived in a state of high anxiety, responding to a direct note from Holmes. Reverend Trafton appeared looking as though he had not slept in a week. Percy Vale came. Holmes had told him plainly that if he did not attend, the details of his activities on the night of his uncle's death would form part of a public statement. And finally, stepping through the warehouse door with the measured tread of a man who has arranged this meeting himself, came Julian Mowbray. He was everything Holmes's description had led me to expect, polished, controlled, with the manner of a man accustomed to the theatre of legal proceedings. He wore an excellent greatcoat. He carried a thin leather briefcase. He looked, when he entered and found the assembled company in the lantern light, merely like a man who has arrived at a slightly more crowded meeting than anticipated, and only the tightening at the corners of his eyes betrayed the calculation occurring behind his composed face. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "is this your working method?" "It is this evening," said Holmes. He stood in the centre of the group with his hands in his coat pockets, and the quiet authority that I have always found more formidable than any raised voice. "I have taken the liberty of gathering all the principal figures in the matter of Sir Alistair Wynne's death, since the truth about it concerns each of them differently. Mr. Mowbray, You are under a misapprehension about the affidavit. There is no surviving duplicate. I invented it to bring you here. Mowbray's expression did not change. He said nothing. Let me set the matter out, Holmes said. 20 years ago, Captain Edmund Bransby was destroyed by 3 men who feared his honesty. He died in disgrace. His son, too young at the time to know the precise nature of the conspiracy, grew up under a different name. He entered the law, where he developed both skill and patience. He traced the surviving men. He obtained access through legitimate legal channels to the Wynne estate. And he conceived not merely revenge, but a revenge that served also as extortion. Recover the documentary proof, ruin Wynne's posthumous name, and use the evidence to bleed Dane and Trafton for whatever years remained to them. That is a remarkable story, said Mowbray. The envelopes were the prologue, Holmes continued. They were designed to break Sir Alistair's nerve, which they accomplished admirably, since the old man's conscience was already doing half the work. The seal was manufactured from fine cigar ash mixed with gum arabic, pressed after the flap was closed. Not a true wax seal at all, but a theatrical emblem. The impression matches a device from an old legal archive you hold. The chambers where Captain Bransby once sought representation. You chose it deliberately, both as personal comment and as misdirection. The Turkish tobacco scent was borrowed from Dane's club blend and applied to the envelopes carefully so that any investigation would turn toward the colonel. Dane made a sound. Trafton closed his eyes. 2 days before Sir Alistair's death, Holmes said, you visited the house on the pretext of the Wynne family trust. During that visit, you contrived to introduce prussic acid into his medicinal tonic. A small dose, carefully measured, sufficient to accumulate over several days in a weakened constitution and produce, when the moment came, a collapse entirely consistent with apoplexy. Later that same night, after Sir Alistair fell, you returned through the garden, using knowledge of the faulty bolt on the servant's entrance which you had identified during your legitimate visit. You retrieved the document packet from the dispatch box wearing gloves. The dust tells that story clearly enough, and you delivered the 4th envelope, by hand from inside the house, not to taunt a dying man, but to establish the narrative. Death by fright. Papers stolen by a phantom from the past. The warehouse was very quiet. From somewhere outside the fog, the river made its slow, indifferent sound. Holmes reached into his coat and produced several sheets of paper. I hold an office sheet from your chambers bearing a griffin and broken key watermark. I hold evidence of chemically matched gum arabic, consistent with the envelope seal, and consistent with a preparation found in your supply closet. I hold a practice impression, found between journal pages in your archive room, in the same hand as the penciled name I discovered today. He paused. I also hold a statement from Miss Fenwick, who was present during your legal visit to Sir Alistair, and who heard you ask her employer, quite directly, whether the Bransby file was maintained in the dispatch box. Mowbray stood quite still. In the lantern light, his face had undergone a subtle transformation. Not collapse, precisely, but a withdrawal. The polish remained over the surface, but something had gone out from behind it. He deserved it, he said at last. Not loudly, with a flat, even quality that was, in its way, more terrible than rage would have been. My father was an honest man. They made him a criminal and a coward in the public record, and they went on, dining and travelling and receiving their honours, for 20 years. I was 10 years old when he died. I attended the inquest. He looked at Holmes without hostility. You are quite right about every particular. I find I cannot pretend otherwise. No, said Holmes. I rather thought not. Lestrade stepped forward. We were back at Baker Street before the city's last cabs had ceased their rattling. The fire had been made up by Mrs. Hudson against our return. and the room had the warm, close, ordered quality that always seemed in the aftermath of a case, like a specific kind of goodness, the goodness of the familiar and the safe. I poured brandy. Holmes stood before the fire with his back to me, looking into the coals. "Dane and Trafton," I said. "What becomes of them?" "They are not guilty of murder. They are guilty of something perhaps worse in its long consequences, the deliberate destruction of an innocent man through the machinery of official authority. The recovered papers will make that clear enough." He turned. "I expect Trafton will confess publicly. He has been wanting to do so for years. You could see it in his face. Dane will resist, but resist in private. His remaining years will not be comfortable." "And Clara Fenwick?" "Sir Alistair's amended will, which I am informed existed but had not been filed, names her as a beneficiary of sufficient standing to live independently. She will not need another employer." He sat down and picked up his pipe, though he did not immediately light it. "The nephew is chastened, which may do him some good. The housekeeper identified the wrong man, but testified truthfully as she understood it, which is all that can be asked of a witness." I sat down across from him. Something had been sitting with me since the warehouse, a discomfort that I could not entirely resolve into a philosophical position. Mowbray had been cold, methodical, and entirely self-possessed in his villainy. And yet, his father was genuinely wronged, I said. "Yes," said Holmes, comprehensively, deliberately, and without remorse from those responsible. "Captain Bransby was an honest man destroyed by smaller ones. His son spent 30 years arranging the account." He turned the pipe over in his fingers. "There are cases, Watson, in which the motive deserves more respect than the means. This is one of them. I will not pretend Mowbray's cause had no justice in it. But he chose to become the very thing he avenged, a man who used a convenient instrument to destroy someone for his own purposes, and called it righteousness." The fire settled. Outside, the fog was beginning its slow dissolution before a rising wind off the river. "He said something in that warehouse," I remarked, "when you had laid everything out. He said you were right about every particular. He seemed almost relieved." Holmes was quiet for a moment. "Men who have lived inside a secret for 30 years often are. The keeping of it is its own kind of imprisonment." He lit his pipe at last. "The tragedy is not that he discovered the truth about his father. The tragedy is that the truth was insufficient for him. He required, beyond justice, the pleasure of arranging their suffering. That appetite is the thing that made him a murderer, rather than merely a man with a grievance. Depend upon it, Watson," he said, after the particular long silence that always indicated he had arrived somewhere conclusive in his thinking. "The dead are seldom so dangerous as the living who have profited by them. What men call a haunting is often only memory furnished with opportunity. I wrote that down as I have written down so many of his observations over the years, not because I doubted I would remember it, but because it seemed to deserve the formality. Some sentences are too precisely right to trust to memory alone. Outside 221B, the fog was thinning at last, and in the street below the gas lamps had come back to themselves, bright, singular, human points of light against the long dark of a November night. I think of them still when I think of this case, the way light persists and returns even in the seasons of the heaviest dark. The Adventure of the Ashen Seal appeared in the case notes of Dr. John H. Watson, bracketed under the November investigations of 1894, and was never among those he chose to publish in his own lifetime, perhaps because, as he once wrote in a marginal note, the justice in it was too complicated for a magazine, and the guilt too widely shared.